Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing something a bit different, and honestly, a bit heavy. We are going to objectively unpack the historical record to understand the darker, truly unvarnished realities of American presidential history. Look, every nation has its dark chapters, right? But what makes a country great isn't pretending those chapters don't exist. It's about looking at the facts clearly so we can actually learn from them. So we're going to dive deep into the historical data, using the records of past commanders-in-chief to examine incidents stretching all the way from the 1800s right up to the modern era. All right, let's quickly hit the agenda. We're going to move chronologically through 5 specific eras: expansion and indigenous displacement, Civil War and Western expansion, imperialism and world wars, the Cold War and secret bombings, and finally, modern warfare and covert tactics. Starting with Section 1, Expansion and Indigenous Displacement, we're kicking things off in the early 1800s. Right off the bat, if we track the history starting in 1819, a really disturbing pattern emerges. It begins with President James Monroe giving tacit approval to Andrew Jackson's incredibly chaotic Florida invasion. During that campaign, peaceful tribes like the Chenahad were mistakenly massacred by Jackson's troops. And that pattern of brutality flowed straight into Jackson's own presidency. By 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, systematically forcing tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole completely off their ancestral homelands to relocate west of the Mississippi River. Now, you might be wondering, wasn't there any legal pushback? Well, when the Supreme Court actually ruled that the Cherokee Nation had the legal right to stay on their land, Andrew Jackson notoriously just brushed off the rule of law. He literally ignored the highest court in the land with this exact defiant quote. He simply pushed forward with a policy that modern historians universally classify as a campaign of ethnic cleansing. And what did that political maneuvering actually look like on the ground? It's captured in this incredibly sobering number. Because of freezing temperatures, rampant disease, and a severe lack of food, anywhere from 4,000 to 15,000 men, women, and children died marching at gunpoint on the Trail of Tears. And the tragic part? It didn't even end with Jackson. His successor, Martin Van Buren, fully committed to enforcing this removal policy, which caused thousands more deaths. Moving right along to Section 2, Civil War and Western Expansion. This covers the mid to late 1800s. Okay, so during the 1862 U.S. Dakota War in Minnesota, Abraham Lincoln actually authorized the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Following a devastating uprising that was heavily driven by starvation, the military quickly put hundreds of Dakota men on trial. But here's the catch. Most of them had zero legal representation. Some of these trials literally lasted just a few minutes. While Lincoln did step in to reduce the number of death sentences from 303 down to 38, those 38 men were still hanged all at once in front of a massive crowd. It was a process completely lacking what any of us today would consider basic due process. Let's fast forward a bit to 1890 under President Benjamin Harrison. This is the incident at Wounded Knee Creek. The U.S. cavalry moved to disarm a band of Lakota, and after a deaf man's rifle accidentally discharged, soldiers just opened fire on a largely disarmed group. The reality of this was grim. It was an unprovoked massacre of up to 300 Lakota, mostly women and fleeing children. Yet, Harrison spun it politically as a battle and astonishingly awarded 20 medals of honor for it. Trying to bury a horrific event is one thing, but handing out medals for it afterward, that's a whole different level of historical distortion. That brings us to Section 3, Imperialism and World Wars, right at the dawn of the 20th century. As America started projecting its power globally, President William McKinley used this exact rhetoric to justify a highly brutal conflict during the Philippine-American War. The reality of this supposed uplifting mission was incredibly dark. U.S. forces literally set up concentration camps to separate fighters from civilians. The campaign included widespread water torture, village burnings, and even an infamous order from a U.S. general to kill anyone over the age of 10. It was so bad that cultural figures like Mark Twain wrote absolutely scathing essays torching this so-called civilizing mission. To put the human cost of that rhetoric into perspective, the horrifying reality was a staggering death toll reaching well over 200,000 Filipinos. And this massive loss of life wasn't just from direct combat. It was heavily driven by the famine and disease that resulted directly from the harsh military tactics employed on those islands. McKinley's successor, Theodore Roosevelt, just continued this aggressive imperial posture. In 1906, U.S. troops surrounded Moro villagers, which included women and children who had taken shelter inside a volcanic crater, and opened fire, killing up to 1,000 people. Roosevelt's response to this? He actually praised the troops. He actively buried reports detailing the civilian cost, just to protect the illusion of American greatness and the triumph of civilization. And this brutalization of the enemy extended even into World War II under Franklin D. Roosevelt. We're talking about a gruesome practice known as trophy taking, where U.S. troops literally mailed home the body parts of Japanese soldiers as souvenirs. It became so widespread that a U.S. congressman actually sent FDR a letter opener made from a Japanese soldier's arm bone. Reportedly, FDR initially welcomed the gift before backtracking and ordering it buried once the optics became clear. It's a stark definition of barbaric behavior that enemy propaganda absolutely weaponized at the time. Which brings us to Section 4, the Cold War and secret bombings. This is really the era of industrialized destruction. The data from mid-century conflicts grounds us in a staggering reality of sheer scale. We start with Truman's highly controversial atomic bombs, which defenders argue ended the war, but critics label as genocidal. Then you have Truman's destruction of North Korean dams that killed roughly 20% of the population. And finally, under Lyndon B. Johnson, the infamous My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where troops murdered hundreds of unarmed villagers. It only stopped because a heroic U.S. helicopter pilot named Hugh Thompson Jr. literally landed his chopper between the troops and the civilians to halt the slaughter. Let's move to Richard Nixon, where things become intensely secretive. Nixon inherited the chaos of Vietnam and launched Operation Menu. This was a massive, secret carpet bombing campaign of completely neutral Cambodia, executed entirely without congressional approval. It caused up to 500,000 deaths, totally destabilized the country, and quite literally paved the way for the Khmer Rouge, whose subsequent genocide killed nearly 2 million more people. Finally, we reach Section 5, Modern Warfare and Covert Tactics. Welcome to the detached modern era. Tracking the last 30 years or so, we see a dramatic shift toward covert and remote tactics. George H.W. Bush called the bombing of the Amiria civilian air raid shelter, which killed over 400 people, a tragic mistake. Bill Clinton launched a Tomahawk missile at what turned out to be Sudan's primary medicine plant, leading to widespread disease. And then we evolve right into the systematic intelligence and drone programs of the post-9/11 world. Following 9/11, under George W. Bush, the traditional rulebook was pretty much tossed out the window. The CIA was given free rein to use what they termed enhanced interrogation techniques. We're talking about horrifying methods used at facilities like Abu Ghraib, methods that international bodies, including the UN, explicitly classified as outright torture and clear, undeniable violations of the Geneva Conventions. You probably remember when those deeply disturbing photos taken by soldiers at Abu Ghraib leaked to the global public. The administration went straight into damage control. Bush tried to spin the systemic abuse with this exact phrase, framing it as the work of just a few bad apples. It was a clear attempt to defend the broader intelligence program, while completely denying its widespread, systematic nature. Now, Barack Obama came into office promising to close Guantanamo and end the torture era, right? But instead, he dramatically expanded the drone strike program. He heavily utilized what are known as signature strikes. This meant targets weren't even selected based on a confirmed identity, but on a pattern of behavior. By default, military-aged males in a designated strike zone could be classified as combatants. It was a major shift from waterboarding to robot assassins from the sky, leading to hundreds of civilian deaths that critics called utterly reckless. So wrapping all of this up, the crux of this entire explainer really boils down to this final question. We've just traced 236 years of history, evolving from face-to-face frontier violence to remote-controlled strikes. How do we face these uncomfortable facts? True greatness requires looking at the unvarnished data, the good and the deeply disturbing, to ensure we actually learn from history instead of blinding ourselves to it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.